owes its original name, Camp Humphreys, to Major General Andrew A. Humphreys, who had been a topographical engineer before the Civil War. During the Civil War, he'd been Chief of Staff of the Army of the Potomac and also a Corps Commander. And then between 1866 and 1879, he's been the Chief of Engineers here at the headquarters of the Department of the Army of Washington. Our story about Camp Humphreys goes back to 1911. And in that year, the District of Columbia took title to the peninsula on which Fort Belvoir now sits because they wanted to build a prison, a reformatory for youths. Well, there was so much community opposition, mainly by the Daughters of the American Revolution, that the prison was never built there. Go a little further down the road to Lortonville, the prison is there, the workhouse is there, and that's why it was built there and not at Belvoir. So because they couldn't use the land, the district turned the land over to the War Department a couple of years later. At that point, the engineer school was at Washington Barracks, which is now Fort McNair, in the District of Columbia. And if you've ever been to Fort McNair, you know it's rather a small place. You can't do much training there. It's really not suited for that. So beginning around 1912, they took title to the land, and then during the summer months, they bring the troops over from Washington Barracks to the peninsula for tactical training and marksmanship training. And the land or the cantonment that they camped on at that time was called Camp Belvoir because of its links to the colonial past with the Fairfax family at Belvoir. And then, of course, in 1917, April 1917, America gets into the First World War, declares war on Germany. The Chief of Engineers at that time, Major General William F. Black, realized that Washington Barracks was too small, and they had Camp Belvoir sitting right there 18 miles south of the District of Columbia. He realized that would be the perfect place to build a large cantonment to train all the engineer soldiers who would be needed to staff the engineer units on the Western Front in France for the American Expeditionary Force. And in fact, by the time the camp was closed down for training in the late autumn of 1918, they had trained about 57,000 engineer soldiers between January 1918 and November 1918 on Armistice Day. So the decision by the Secretary of War to open up Camp Humphreys was made in December of 1917, and then construction began in earnest the following month in January of 1918. The construction was so feverish during this time that on most days during the height of the construction, there were 6,000 construction workers on post building Camp Humphreys. And they constructed hundreds of these wooden buildings, barracks, mess halls, administrative buildings, classrooms, and so forth on the peninsula. And fortunately, the Belvoir Peninsula was the perfect site to build this cantonment for a number of reasons. Number one, it was close to the District of Columbia. It's only 18 miles away. The rail line for the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railway was only 4 miles away, so they could build a spur line right into the post. You had the Washington, Virginia Electric Line with the terminus at Mount Vernon here, so that was close by. And of course, it was right on the river, so you could use that for river traffic back and forth. The peninsula itself was also an excellent choice. Number one, on the western side of the peninsula, you had the shoreline that could be used by the engineer soldiers for bridge training, permanent and pontoon bridges. The entire peninsula was covered with this virgin forest filled with timber that engineer soldiers would need for revetments and other engineer structures they would have to build. The main peninsula was about 180 feet higher than the river line, and that flat peninsula became the perfect place, once it was cleared, to build the central parade ground, bordered on either side by the various buildings, these hundreds of buildings that were bordering the central parade and drill field. And the slopes around the central parade ground were perfect for building trenches, building bunkers and things that they would need to build to train the soldiers for the Western Front in France. So construction began in earnest, as I said, in January of 1918. Of course, this was the most severe winter in Virginia in years. For most of that winter, there was at least a foot of snow on the ground, and the temperatures hovered around 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Some days it was 16 degrees below zero. And you can imagine the troops not only had to train, but they had to build this cantonment at the same time that winter was going on. And then on 11 February, the thaw arrived. It got warm all of a sudden. And all the roads leading into the posts and on posts just turned into mud. They're just miles and miles of bottomless mud that had to be negotiated. The interesting photograph I have, my favorite photograph, is this one. This is Route 1 in October 1918. And that photograph was taken just south of here. If you know where the McDonald's is, on top of that hill, looking down towards Fort Belvoir, that's the scene that we have listed there in October of 1918. They actually paved Route 1 in October 1918 with concrete. Now, the other photographs show you what the cantonment looked like. Here's a photograph of the central parade ground, the central drill field, with these two-story wooden buildings. And as I said before, the cantonment is filled with these buildings. Each one of those barracks buildings could house 66 soldiers, and they were really crammed in there, and I'm going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. I talked about the bridge training. Down on Gunston Cove, along the western side of the peninsula, they used that area to do the pontoon bridge training the soldiers had to do as engineer soldiers. And the last photograph is the engineer school headquarters, right over here. If you're familiar with Fort Belvoir at all, by the central parade field, the parade field number 1, the actual headquarters was located where those Little League baseball fields are located now. So that was Fort Belvoir, Camp Humphreys at the time.